Test, test. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get ready to get the program started. I'm going to ask you to take your seats as we get ready to get started. Thank you. Before we start formally, I just want to tell our audience that's here, we have a special treat courtesy of our friends at Frontline at the end of the program. So it's going to sound like we're wrapping things, and you're just going to stay in your seats for a few minutes. You're going to like it at the end, but we're not going to say it on the live stream. Well, good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Mark Simpson. I'm Maine Public's Director of News and Public Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Bates College campus, and thank you for joining us here tonight. We're about to listen to a segment from our upcoming podcast about Lewiston. I wanted to let you know that it does deal with sensitive topics and strong adult language related to our reporting and may not be suitable for all ears. Also want to say welcome to all our viewers online as we live stream this event. We recognize this is a difficult topic, and if you feel the need to speak with someone, we have two counselors who are seated along the back, and you can approach them, and we have a private area set aside for you if you feel the need. On your way here tonight, on your way in, you should have received a postcard, and you can use that to write down any questions you have and raise your cards up as you get your questions filled out. And my colleagues Sadie and Sophie, can I get a wave of hands from Sadie and Sophie? They're somewhere back there, yes? They're there on the sides. Sadie and Sophie are going to collect them. They'll bring them to me, and I promise I'll get to as many of them as I can. Of course, we're being live streamed over YouTube and Facebook and other social platforms, so this is your reminder to please limit as much noise as you can because we're recording, and it's a good reminder to do something like silence your cell phone, which I just had to do myself. I want to just give a project overview. We're going to talk about the podcast, which is called Breakdown, and Maine Public's newsroom has been working on that for several months. We're also here to examine the reporting of two of our local newspapers. That's the Portland Press Herald and the Lewiston Sun-Journal that have commissioned numerous stories over the past year. And we're partners in all of this thanks to the local journalism project at Frontline, which of course is known as the premier accountability reporting documentary unit housed at WGBH in Boston. And there is a documentary film coming out about Lewiston associated with this project, hopefully later this year. And also during our program, right after our panel discussion, we're going to have a moment for learning more about the deaf and hard of hearing community. But first, we're going to hear the opening of episode 1 of the Breakdown podcast.
A warning, this story contains descriptions of violence that may not be suitable for everyone. It's a Wednesday night, and I'm driving back from an assignment in western Maine when 2 police cars go screaming past me. I'm just a few minutes from my house when my husband calls. He says he's just gotten an alert on his phone. Active shooter in Lewiston. Before I can absorb what he's saying, I get an alert telling me to shelter in place. We both work in Lewiston, and live just across the Androscoggin River in Auburn. Locals call these the Twin Cities, or the other LA, the smaller, less glamorous version, about as far from Hollywood as you can get. We're about 45 minutes north of Portland. We're not on the coast, not deep in the woods. These are former mill towns built by French Canadians and other immigrants who came to work in shoe factories and textile mills more than 100 years ago. Around here, it's not uncommon for people to work more than one job. They take their kids to football and cheerleading practice and meet up for burgers and beers, the occasional cornhole game.
Seven County got multiple victims. I need multiple victims. I need every unit you can.
Scanner traffic and police reports on social media say the shooter has hit two places, a bowling alley and a bar. They're about 4 miles apart. I know the bowling alley, everyone does. It's where we took our kids to birthday parties when they were little, and one of the few places in town families can hang out. I tell my husband I'm heading there, and I'm not sure when I'll be back. He tells me to please be careful. Outside the bowling alley, police cars are everywhere. The road is blocked off. I get out in a nearby parking lot and watch as a sheriff's deputy directs a group of people into a building. Then he sees me. "Leave immediately," he yells. "There's been a mass shooting. No one is safe out here." Mass shooting. Let those two words sink in. We hear them so often about a concert in Las Vegas, a nightclub in Colorado Springs, an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, a Walmart in El Paso, and on in far-flung cities and towns. It's often said that Americans are becoming indifferent to gun violence, and that it's just a matter of time before it happens where you live. There were 656 mass shootings in the U.S. in 2023, and the one in Lewiston in my backyard would be the year's deadliest.
I'm profoundly saddened to stand before you today to report that 18 people lost their lives and 13 people injured in last night's attacks.
We now know that the attacks were carried out by a part-time soldier in the Army Reserve, a man who bowled and played cornhole with some of the victims. For months, he was unraveling. He believed people were mocking him and posting insults about him online. He was delusional, he was making threats, he owned lots of guns, and members of law enforcement and the Army Reserve were well aware. They were concerned enough to protect themselves, but stopped short of confronting him before it was too late.
Still get up every morning and I go to bed every night thinking of my son and trying to figure out why would anything like this happen.
When a mass shooting happens, there's a flood of attention. Reporters show up and then, eventually, most leave or move on. Our newsroom at Maine Public Radio has covered every development of this story. We've spent months combing through documents, listening to testimony, and interviewing dozens of people. But we've also reported on the milestones and setbacks as the community tries to recover.
Please, Lewiston, do not lose hope.
For the victims, their loved ones, and everyone affected by this tragedy, the ability to heal means understanding what happened. Over 6 episodes, you'll hear from several of us, each with a different part of the story about what went wrong and why. How Maine's hunting tradition makes guns central to its politics, and the aftermath for shooting victims, some of whom are deaf and hard of hearing. But this is also a story about the possibility for change, how the lessons of Lewiston might help make us safer. Because unless we are truly indifferent, we have to try.
It feels like it was yesterday. It really does. It's still so real and so vivid.
My brother-in-law was not this man. His brain was hijacked.
None of us should be allowed to say that we did enough in this scenario, in this situation.
When you try to depict all firearms as evil, as killing, as You're missing the boat here.
To this day, I can't believe he's dead. I can't believe that these people are dead.
From Maine Public Radio, the Portland Press Herald, and Frontline PBS, this is Breakdown. I'm Susan Sharon. Episode 1. Did we really survive this?
I've heard that a bunch of times. It chokes me up. The podcast is amazing. I have to tell you that. It's really powerful. 6 episodes are coming on it. The first one is going to be released this week. We explore the timeline of the event, as you started to hear there. We move into policy, gun culture, the deaf community, and next steps. It's very powerful. So when you have a story like this, where do you begin to talk about it? Where do you enter the story? And so we're going to do that with our panel tonight here. And then we have a special presentation from Thomas Minch of the deaf community about our Lewiston experience, and we'll have a chance to take those audience questions. So to kick things off, I just want to introduce our American Sign Language interpreters. We've got Julia Schaefer and Erica No from MJ Grant Interpreting, who are helping us out tonight, and thank you very much to them. And then on our panel, we've got John Terhune, who reports on police and crime for the Portland Press Herald. He previously covered the cities of Bath and Brunswick for the Times-Record and was a staff writer for The Forecaster, a former Waterville Panther. John returned to Maine after studying philosophy at Middlebury College in Vermont and journalism at Boston University. John, great to have you with us. Patty White, my colleague at Maine Public Radio, is a graduate of University of Vermont and has won multiple awards as a reporter for Maine Public Radio, specializing with us in health coverage and policy stories, patient stories, mental and physical health, anything in between. She's also taken a turn behind the microphone as one of our hosts for Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and started with Maine Public Radio in 2012, which... Gosh, Patty, I can't believe it's that. Steve Missler, another colleague at Maine Public Radio, is, of course, our chief politics and government correspondent. He's based out of Augusta at the State House and been a journalist for nearly 2 decades, specializing in coverage of state government. His work has been recognized by the Maine Press Association, Regional Murrow Awards also, and a PMJA Award for writing. And then Steve Collins joins us from the Lewiston Sun-Journal. Since fleeing law school decades ago, Steve has worked for daily newspapers in New York, Connecticut, and Maine, has been the State House reporter for the Sun-Journal since 2016, is founder and board president of Youth Journalism International, and he holds a degree from University of Virginia in history. Thank you so much, everybody. And Steve Collins, wanted to start with you here as the hometown paper, talking about where Lewiston is today. What would you call the tone of the community, the emotional level in Lewiston as we are just days away from this 1-year anniversary?
Well, as the fellow said in the podcast about Lewiston not losing hope, I think that is really a big part of what we've seen in Lewiston is not losing hope. People in Lewiston, I mean, let's face it, most people aren't thinking too much about any of this. But the people who have been hurt, the people who were there, people who have tried to help, and they number in the thousands, this is all so emotional. I can't even begin to tell you, talking to people who were there about how difficult it is for people just to get up and get going each day, but they do it because they have to, and trying to make the best of it. I think in Lewiston, people have really stepped up. They've tried to live up to that, all the signs are all over town talking about how strong Lewiston is. People are trying to do that to show show what they're capable of, and to find ways to take this horrible, awful event and make something good come out of it. The other day, I was talking to one of the guys who was shot at Schmenge's, a fellow named Ben Dyer, who was badly wounded. He was in the hospital for 19 days, almost didn't make it. And he told me, I asked him like how his girlfriend was doing, because I had met her way back when, and he said, well, she's not my girlfriend anymore. And I said, oh. And he said, yeah, she's my fiance now. And they're getting married next October 25th, because he said they want to take this day back. They want to make it something where, instead of memories of gunfire and smoke, to make it something joyful. And I think that kind of sums up, the sort of spirit that a lot of people were showing. And,
I wanted to ask this question of our panel of reporters here. I think we, as journalists, wrestle with this idea of wanting to honor an anniversary, but also reflect. There's sometimes tension in a community about wanting to move forward. And how do you capture that? What does it mean as a reporter? I just wonder what you might think about that. And I guess I'll just go down the row here, starting with you, John Terhune.
So for me, it is something that I've struggled with, the extent to which we have a responsibility to be looking forward, looking at systemic changes that need to be happen. Like, there's a lot of conversations that I think we need to have. And then at the same time, there's the piece about honoring the victims, being really sensitive towards the current needs of the community in ways that go beyond kind of solutions-oriented thinking. For me, the thing that has been really helpful is that there's a lot of really good reporters in the state working on the story from a bunch of different angles. And so I can take time writing about government accountability, about the mental health system, while knowing that Steve at the Sun Journal or Susan Sharon is doing the equally important work of telling the real stories of the victims. So I think it's all kind of a team effort.
Yeah. Patty White, what do you think on that?
I mean, I think this was brought up in what we heard from the podcast excerpt, but as we try to move forward, it is important to try to learn from what happened, and I think that's a really important thing to do. And also, our job as reporters is to offer people who are affected by events like this the chance to share their stories if they want to, and that's a really important thing to do. So I think that's how we're looking to move forward.
Steve Missel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and I think about it all the time, because in the back of my head, every time I'm sitting down to write these stories or report them, I know that there's a lot of people who just would rather move on, and I totally get that, because when something like this happens, the people who are affected, whether it's the family members or the survivors, these folks are grieving in public, and that's a really tough thing to do. And to sort of be a part of that and keep this in the public sphere is a tough thing, because I think, in the back of my head, I think that's what I would want to do. I would want to just sort of plow this into my memory and just sort of move on. But at the same time, I do think that what we're doing is really important, because as John pointed out, I think there's a lot of discussion about policy, politics, changes that might need to occur as a result of this tragedy. And, that's important work. And so is accountability. And that is a key piece of this, I think. And that's something that I've been focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Steve Collins, anything to add there?
Well, I think as you listen to these three, you can see why Maine's journalism community is so great. I mean, they're just terrific people and doing terrific work. And it's like across the board. There's a lot of people who aren't here who are also doing great work. And it's hard, and I think a lot of people don't really appreciate what goes into that. I mean, that we are a lot more thoughtful than you probably think we are. And that we are, there's so many things to have to balance with every story, and we're trying to do it right.
I appreciate that. I didn't write this part down, but I just thought of it as I'm hearing these colleagues, and theoretically they're from competitors. We're all competitors in the news biz, but it's really brought us together, I think, as reporters in a unique way. And working on a project like this, it's just been really expansive for us, I think. So, almost a year of accountability reporting and discovery along the way. All of our reporters have been focused on particular areas during their coverage. In this partnership, a lot of the reporting has been digging for and waiting for answers. And there was big anticipation that the reports from the Army and from the Lewiston Shooting Commission were going to provide deep revelations about what happened and why. And John Terhune, Steve Missler, you in particular have been focusing in on these reports in your coverage. Did we get those answers, John?
I think in certain areas we really have a good understanding of what happened, and in other areas we are waiting for answers. So, for example, I think that the interactions that the Saginaw County Sheriff's Office had with the shooter in the months before Lewiston have been detailed really closely. We've looked at the legal analysis of what steps were taken, were not taken, what should have happened, and you can kind of come to different conclusions on blame or ultimate responsibility there, but I think the facts at this point are out there for the public to see. You take an area like the mental health system, the shooter's experience in the hospital in New York, his subsequent release from the hospital. I think there's a lot more gray area there. Medical privacy laws have largely prevented us from getting at the documents that would show exactly what happened there. And the groups that have commissioned these reports have not gone into as great detail, either because they tried and failed to get the answers themselves, or because they weren't necessarily as interested in getting to the bottom of wading into those kind of ethically murky areas. That's still unclear, but there's definitely things that we're still trying to figure out here.
Steve, you were there when the reports came down. You're jumping in. You're going through hundreds, thousands pages of documents. What stood out to you, and what do you think was missing in those reports?
Where to begin? I think there was a lot of anticipation about the Army report, and there were some revelations in there. The biggest one to me is that the Army, who was overseeing this reservist responsible for this tragedy, they didn't have any good answers as to why this person was released from a psychiatric hospital when he'd been command directed to go there. That's still a bit of a mystery. There's some, John, I think in particular, started to fill in some of those gray areas, but I was expecting more from that Army report in that regard. As it relates to the commission report from the Governor Janet Mills, basically advanced and picked the members of the commission. A lot of what was there, I think, it was interesting to have all that stuff and helpful in some ways, have a document that did, a relatively accurate timeline of events and what was done and what wasn't. But I felt like that report was wanting in a couple of areas. One is that it really did seem to me to focus a lot on placing blame on individuals as opposed to an examination of policy and systems. I think it stayed well clear of that, and the reasoning for that is one I understand from a political perspective, but not necessarily one in terms of helping people, coming to some sort of closure in some respects, or maybe even better, looking forward to what might be needed to prevent this kind of thing from happening later. That's my high-level view of those two reports, but I think at the end of the day, they were helpful in some ways, but there's a lot of blaming it, like I said, blaming of individuals and not an examination of of policies or what policies might come later or should.
Steve, I want to peel back just a little bit on the reporting process and ask you to sort of encapsulate for our audience. There was this moment where one of these reports came out and they suddenly realized that the redactions that they had intended to place you were able to get past the redactions and see stuff. Did that, and some of us were able to capture those documents, and they, so revealing in a way they hadn't intended.
Right.
Did information come out was that helpful or not really?
Well, the redactions mistake was actually related to a document dump from the Maine State Police. They had tried to redact some information in there unsuccessfully. And so we were able, being reporters who handle these kind of things sometimes, we were able to find those. And in some cases they were helpful, but also in some cases you kind of wondered why they redacted it in the first place. But that's common as well. So yeah, I think, that's like one of the things, I mean, the great thing about that document dump was actually reporting on it and going through it as a team. Basically, it was a Zoom call. It was myself, it was John, it was Susan Sharon, our deputy news director, it was Julia, one of the editors at the Press Herald, basically taking sections of thousands and thousands of pages and combing through each one just to find something, some clues, some news. And that was cool. That was fun to report that way because that's something we just don't usually do. So it was just nice to have that firepower as a team to be able to look through those materials and find some things that were of interest. And that's the other thing about a project of this depth is that there's always bits and pieces, and they may not seem like much in the moment, but when you step back and you put them all together, they do create a narrative and an understanding of what happened. And I think in their totality, the police reports, the Army report, and the Commission report have been helpful in filling in those gaps.
John Terhune, on that theme of peeling back sort of the documentary process, you've done traveling outside of Maine for your coverage of this. You went to Arizona to interview a former Surgeon General of the United States, and you also tried to gain access to the Four Winds medical facility where Robert Card had been treated. Talk us through some of that, and what did you find out or not find out on some of those external reporting trips that took you outside of the state?
Right, so I've spent a lot of time over the past year trying to dig into the mental health piece of the story, because again, this has been the piece that has been discussed least publicly. Even the commission meetings where we really have learned most parts of this timeline, the commission wasn't able to get anybody from the New York hospital to publicly testify. We learned later they had a closed-door conversation with one of the doctors there. But that meant that part of the story was a black box for a long time for us. And so I've been trying to get at that by calling the doctors of the shooter, by calling other experts to get more context around the mental health system as a whole, and then, by taking a couple trips to different parts of the country here. As a print journalist, I usually get to pick up the phone when I want to have a conversation like that, but when there is a documentary in play, you got to go with the cameras. So it was a long 36 hours to get out to Arizona a couple of months ago to interview Dr. Richard Carmona, who is a former U.S. Surgeon General who now does a lot of work in the brain injury concussion space. The short answer to what you're saying here is that I have not been able to get, and have that conversation with the shooter's doctor and have them explain to me exactly what happened there. I will likely never get that conversation, even as I keep pushing for it, because there are privacy laws at play here. So the best thing I've been able to do is to just really understand the larger context around things like involuntary commitment laws, understanding how the process is supposed to work when somebody is released from a psychiatric hospital, who is supposed to be following that person. So we don't have the specific answers yet, but by looking at the general, we've been able to kind of hone in on some things that probably went wrong. And as civil litigation moves forward here, the answers might come out in a courtroom.
In New York, do I have this right? Did they call the police on you? The camera crew, is that right? Or no?
Yes, so there was an awkward scenario. We went to Four Winds Psychiatric Hospital. I really, as a journalist, don't like scaring people. I try to give people every opportunity to not talk to me if they don't want to talk to me. I spent months and months and months calling Four Winds, leaving voicemails, sending emails. It got to the point where my messages were saying things like, hey, I understand if you can't legally talk to me, can you please call me back and say you're not going to talk to me so I can stop calling you and bugging you? Like, I need some indication that you've gotten these messages, or else my job is to keep doing this. And I never got any sort of response. So at a certain point, it was like, well, let's go knock on the door and see what happens. And they were freaked out, which is an uncomfortable moment. Again, it's not something I usually like to do. It's easier to make somebody uncomfortable when you're that frustrated with them for just kind of like not giving you the common courtesy to say we're not going to talk to you. So we showed up. They said, you have to go. We got in the car and left, but I think they were worried that we were going to like stake out the hospital or try to slip in the back door, and so they did call the police on us. We had a quick conversation with the police officers, who didn't seem to be particularly worried about us, and then we were on our way.
That maybe will make it in the documentary. Maybe.
I don't know if we had the cameras rolling when the police showed up, and the camera people were definitely like, oh shit, we should have got that on film.
Always be rolling. Okay. In our episode 4 of the podcast, it focuses on Maine's gun culture, and Steve Missler, you've been focusing on that quite a bit. You, in this piece, explore gun culture. You also do a bit of historical time travel in the piece, which is interesting. You were able to pull up bits of vintage tape from old reporting on guns that had aired. Was it CBS?
Yeah, that's right. It was CBS. They had aired a documentary in 1975. It's called The Guns of Autumn. And this documentary led to the creation of one of the most influential gun rights groups in the state. And it was the Guns of Autumn was basically this documentary about, it purported to be about hunting. But hunters didn't take it that way. They saw it as a unfair sort of polemic. And the group that we spent some time focusing on, the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, was born out of that backlash. And so, yeah, we were able to play some bits of that documentary, which is interesting because I think Dan Rather is in it. He's one of the narrators, and he does not sound like most of you will probably remember him in that documentary. But it's interesting. I mean, I found the dive into history to be one of the most fascinating parts of the project that I did, of the podcast in particular, because you just see this evolution of the gun debate in politics. I mean, back in the 80s, everybody was freaked out about handguns. And who talks about handgun violence now? Nobody. Now it's, assault-style rifles, semi-automatic weapons that look like machine guns. And it's just interesting to see the evolution of what happened and how Maine has played a role in that.
So you have a bit of tape here, too, in part of that episode, where you go back and speak with former Portland Police Chief Michael Chitwood. Do you want to set this up as we get ready to hear?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Some spiciness.
Yeah, there will be some language here, as anybody who knows Michael Chitwood would come to expect. He was the Portland Police Chief from, I think it was 1988 to 2005. And he did something that few people do in this state, which is try to take on the gun rights political machine. But he came at it in a way that also sort of played into a lot of the arguments that gun rights advocates in this state, that they like this because he's from Philadelphia. He was a homicide detective there. He's one of the most decorated cops in Philadelphia history. When he came to Maine, there were 400 homicides in the city of Philadelphia. So when he came to Maine, Portland, Maine, the first day he walked into his office, which you'll hear a little bit about in a moment, was the beginning of this odyssey. And I don't know if that's a good setup or not, Mark, but that's the best thing to do.
I think let's take that as a cue and see if we can roll it.
Michael Chitwood is now 80 years old, enjoying retirement in Florida and still taking phone calls from reporters. He arrived in Portland as one of the most decorated cops in Philadelphia history. He was brash and charismatic, and he gave great sound bites.
I use the buzzword purveyors of death, but they're murderers. They're animals. There's no other way to describe it. He's a bum, he's a scumbag, he's a dirtball, whatever you want to say.
Chitwood's swashbuckling approach to crime fighting made him an instant celebrity. But his quest for gun control quickly put him at odds with pro-gun House Speaker John Martin, the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and the NRA.
I soon learned that they, in fact, were as powerful as they are, and they controlled it all.
The stage was set for conflict literally the day Chitwood walked into his new office and noticed a foot-high stack of folders on his desk.
In fact, when I looked at the pile, I said, what the fuck is this?
His assistant explained that they were concealed weapons permits for him to sign. Back in Philly, you didn't get a permit to carry a hidden gun without a background check. But things were different in Maine.
There's no check to see if they're mentally ill, to check to see if they're domestic violence abusers, nothing.
Chitwood refused to sign the permits, and gun rights groups took notice. The conflict simmered as Chitwood continued to make a public case for gun control, and intensified further when he began using Portland's local ordinances to crack down on gun owners.
They went absolutely ballistic.
A few months later, the legislature, with the help of Speaker Martin, enacted a sweeping law that nullified all Maine municipal gun ordinances, including those with waiting periods. But after 5 Maine kids were accidentally shot and killed over a 5-month period, Chitwood found traction in the media as he pushed for safe gun storage laws. It was clear at this point that Speaker Martin couldn't silence Chitwood with legislation, so he created a special public safety commission, and he invited the police chief to join it. The panel was stacked with pro-gun legislators. 6 of them were endorsed by Sam and had received campaign cash from the NRA.
Personally, I think that John Martin was just trying to placate me by putting me on that commission. It meant nothing. Believe me, it meant nothing.
Because nothing came out of it, right?
No, nothing came out of it. It was all bullshit. Excuse my expression, but that's what it was. It was total bullshit. He's got a big mouth. Let's put him on the committee.
So you get a sense there, real character, for those who don't know, Michael Chitwood. Yeah. But in your piece, Steve, you go through his relationship with politics and the sort of apparatus here in the state around gun culture. You explore very closely the relation of the Sportsmen's Alliance and their head, David Trahan, the relationship with Governor Mills, how they helped to craft the yellow flag law. You explore this all very deeply, but I think the question on my mind and many others is, now that we're approaching this 1-year anniversary, where is gun politics headed to in Maine?
Yeah, that's a tough
Not to put you on the spot, Steve.
No, it's something I think about a lot. And I do think, so there were several reforms that were passed this year that had failed, frankly, in previous years. One of them, 3-day waiting period to purchase guns, that literally failed just last year. That passed this year without the governor's signature. An expansion of background checks also passed. That was in the governor's bill. And in 2016, that measure failed because voters had rejected it. I think maybe 3 counties in the entire state supported that measure. The other 13 did not. So in that sense, right? That's significant. Those are extraordinary advances for gun control activists. But there were setbacks, and I don't want to give too much away here, but you'll read more about those pretty soon, I suspect, and you'll hear it in the podcast too. There are definitely setbacks, but I think on the whole, I think the big question is, have gun control groups in this state gained this long-sought foothold that has been denied them for, ever, I think? I don't know when the gun control activists in this state have really been able to get the ear of leading politicians until this year. And so I think in that sense, the question then becomes, how is that temporary? And I think the 2024 elections will have something to do, play some role in determining and answering that question, because every single seat in the Maine legislature is up this year, as it is every 2 years. And I think, what happens there, if there is a electoral price paid by some of the lawmakers that supported these measures, that may actually end up being a setback for gun control groups in this state. We'll see. But it is, I think on the whole, though, it is just sort of interesting to think about how dominant the gun rights groups have been in this state for, forever, really. And, I kind of drop in the mid-'70s and kind of take us to today in the podcast. And I don't think that their power is all that diminished, frankly. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which will hopefully come out in the pieces that you'll hear and read about in the coming days, weeks, hopefully days.
Yeah, Steve's hinting there's an article to be dropped soon.
Yeah.
I want to turn back to Patty White, who pushed very strongly for us to have an episode about the deaf and hard of hearing community in the podcast. And for us who've been working on this project, this event has opened up thinking for us, for many of us to recognize a new awareness of the deaf and hard of hearing community. And with that comes a realization that they are treated as a marginalized community. And we're starting to better grasp how they interpret their world, understanding that American Sign Language is a first language. And we have been, I think, getting ready for at least rarely tread ground with our podcast. We're going to have an American Sign Language version of it created, which was a great question. How do you create an American Sign Language version of an oral product? But it's made us really eager to engage with the deaf and hard of hearing community, and I'm so glad that we have our interpreters here today. But Patty, talk us through what you started to learn about the deaf and hard of hearing experience as you went through your reporting in the sort of aftermath of the Lewiston events.
Well, I think we learned in the hours and days after the shootings that, we learned that 4 members of the deaf community were killed, and it's believed to be the deadliest mass shooting of deaf people in the U.S. So it affected the local and the national community really hard. And on top of that loss, this community also faced significant barriers to communication and information. And it happened in many different settings. It happened in state briefings, it happened in news coverage, it happened in hospitals. And the reason why is because American Sign Language interpreters either weren't included, as was the case in state briefings initially, or even after they were included, you couldn't always see them, either because there wasn't a place for them to stand in view of video cameras, or they just weren't included in video frames. And in the case of hospitals, the night of the shootings, there were members of the deaf community who were injured, who needed treatment, and they needed American Sign Language interpreters, and they didn't have access to them even though there were interpreters available, because when word got out about what happened, interpreters came to Lewiston. They wanted to help, but they weren't let into hospitals for several hours. And what that meant was deaf patients had to rely on this technology called video remote interpreting, which is where you connect to an interpreter remotely on a video screen. And there are reasons why it's used, but it can also be problematic. And I think we're going to play an excerpt about that.
Okay, so this is a remote interpreter unit.
Malvina Gregory is standing in front of a rolling cart with an iPad connected by a pole. Gregory is the Director of Interpreter and Cross-Cultural Services at Portland-based Maine Health. It's the largest healthcare system in the state.
So I'm going to just tap and open up the call to find a sign language interpreter.
Within moments, a friendly male interpreter appears on the screen. But as he explains VRI, his image freezes and his voice becomes garbled.
And then I would be ready to go and say, tilt the camera towards your patient.
A weak Wi-Fi connection is the problem, says Gregory.
And this is the frustration that some of the patients have, is that his image is freezing a little bit, right? We're getting some digitization of it. It will drop out.
My hands moving smoothly?
Yeah, no, we can't actually. It's actually very blurred to us.
So we wanted to play that excerpt because it does show some of the appeal of VRI, which is that you can connect to an interpreter instantly, but it also shows how problematic it can be, because if there's a poor Wi-Fi connection, you can't see the interpreter. And I think the fact that this poor Wi-Fi connection happened during a demonstration, just underscores that this is not a rare problem. This actually happens all the time. And I think, for probably most of us here, we've had phone calls or video calls where you don't have a great connection, and we know how frustrating that is. But then if you think about if you're in a hospital, if you're sick, if you've just survived an incredibly traumatic experience, and this is the system that you have to rely on to communicate, just how difficult and frustrating that would be. And this is actually just one example of a problem with VRI, and also just one example of the barriers to communication that the deaf and hard of hearing community faces.
And you've sort of had this reporter's journey, right? You thought the story might be one thing when you were starting out, but where did it end up, and how is that different from what the actual story turned out to be?
I mean, I think, going into this, we thought that this episode would be about what happened, why, how did it affect members of the deaf community, and then it would transition into how the deaf and hard of hearing community got long overdue attention and what improvements have happened since then. And I was really surprised as I reported this and talking to members of the deaf community to learn that there actually have not been many improvements. There are efforts underway. There are members of the deaf and hard of hearing community meeting with state agencies. They've traveled down to the U.S. Capitol. The National Association of the Deaf is watching Maine because they think we could be a model if changes in how we, our policies for how we respond in emergencies and communication, if we have improvements in that could be a model for other states. But I was just really surprised to learn that more changes haven't happened by now. And what I learned from some of the people that I spoke to is that, even though there are these positive steps, there is concern that interest will wane, because that is what's happened in the past. There's initial interest and then it dissipates. And so the extent to which these improvements will be significant or sustained is pretty uncertain.
I think that's sort of my follow-up question for our panel as we get ready to move to our next segment, is how do you sustain coverage on something like this? How do you keep it fresh? What do you do, or how do you think about it? And I'll throw it as a jump ball, whoever wants to go.
I don't think you've talked in a while.
All right, I'll take a first crack at it. Okay, so first off, the reality is there will be less coverage over time. I mean, that's just inevitable. We all, of course, have a responsibility to try to keep the stories going on things that people need to act on. And, you've heard some of them here, that if we walk away from it, nothing's going to change. And so, you just have to keep trying to balance. There's always new news, and you're trying to cover that, but you can't just forget things that happened. It's kind of a duty that falls on us, and so we all try to do it.
Sure. Yeah, I think Steve's touched on it. I think it is tricky, right? You know, this is we're looking at the same set of baseline facts in this tragedy, and so what you're tempted to do is to sort of move to the newest thing, the newest development. I think and that's important. But I think at the end of the day, you got to go back to the people who are most affected by this, and that should sort of steer your approach, right? You want to think about the people who are owed explanations or accountability or change. And I think that is a sustaining thing for me when I'm thinking about doing these stories, or if I'm just exhausted from doing this story. There's been plenty of those moments, but you know, one of the things that sort of picked me up from some tough edits or something like, or something along those lines, and just developing these stories, is that there are a lot of people who are sort of counting on us to keep going, and I think, or at least I hope they are, and that's, you know, that definitely drives me, that's going to be my approach going forward as we sort of watch policy changes, whether they're through the legislature or Congress, or if there are none. We're going to keep an eye on that. We're going to link the inaction or action back to this tragedy, as long as I'm covering state government. So.
You both have answered it so well. Yeah, I think it's a theme that we sort of touched on, but you know, you want something good to come from this, some sort of improvements that maybe prevent a similar event in the future, or improvements. You know, I think these shootings also, in the example of the deaf and hard of hearing community, you know, it shed a light on something that's actually a problem in everyday life. And so I just think it's important to remember some of those other lessons and to keep tracking them to make sure that there are improvements.
Yeah, I think Steve captured it for me in talking about, you know, thinking about what people are owed here. I think back in the months immediately after the shooting, it was all these balls got dropped, and people lost their lives because of it. People lost their family members because of it. And we need to explain how that happened. And now it's kind of taken on another level of that as we've gone through the fact-finding process. And for us to be here a year later and to get all these reports and to sit there and think, you know, not all the answers are there. There are parts of this story that still have not gotten to the people who deserve the answers. And I think that's the victims especially, but I think it's all of us. I mean, this was a crime against the community, and I am, just like I was driven to go knock on Four Winds' door and make them uncomfortable because I was so frustrated with them. I think that's like a big part of what is keeping me going now, is that just like, it's crazy to me that we still don't have all the information. There are still things hidden, and it's kind of our job to help solve that, I think.
Infuriating, honestly, at times, so.
Appreciate those insights, and I'm going to move to our next presenter now, and that is Thomas Minch, who is the project director and advocate for deaf and hard of hearing survivors and victims at the Maine Resiliency Center, known as MRC. Thomas has a strong commitment to supporting the deaf and hard of hearing community, especially in the aftermath of the October 25th incident. His involvement with the Maine Association of the Deaf and Disability Rights of Maine demonstrates his dedication to advocacy and resource coordination. We're going to have Thomas's translator come to the microphone here, and Thomas, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I am Thomas. I am the project director. October 25th was the first mass shooting that occurred with deaf individuals from the community that was involved, where 20% of those who were killed were deaf. That number is high. That is a high number. Now, with this occurrence, The country is looking at us. The deaf and hard of hearing community is looking at us. And we're trying to navigate this. The first night, the first barrier that we noticed was the press conference that happened that night. There was no closed captioning. There were no interpreters. So the deaf and hard of hearing community was already facing a lack of information, where you all received that information by getting it auditorily. We had to rely on social media to gather our information, to fact find, to find out what was happening that evening. And through that course, there was a lot of misunderstandings. And so we, the Maine Association of the Deaf, along with Disability Rights of Maine, we reached out to different news stations, different media outlets here in Maine to make sure that interpreters were placed on camera, where the full screen shot encompassed both the presenter and the interpreter, along with captioning. That has improved. And again, during the 6 months memorial that occurred in Lewiston, I stood behind every single camera that was positioned to make sure that everyone was focusing on the interpreter. I had to go to each individual news source to make sure I reminded them. That was 6 months, and I still had to remind all of them to make sure that they included the interpreter in each of those shots. So that is an improvement. We are seeing that as an improvement. I will say the biggest challenge that we are facing is a lack of interpreters in the state of Maine. There is a shortage. Before October 25th, interpreter requests were rather steady. After that night, requests started coming in. They wanted to have interpreters there for different community events, for Christmas lightings, for different community events, to make sure that they were ensuring access to the entire community, which is fabulous. However, we don't have the interpreters to meet the demand. So in some sense, we have people that attend events, but there's just not the interpreters to cover them, and so they are not having equal access. Patty, the work that you've been doing with the deaf community has been amazing. It has been very transparent, and we are looking forward to working with you moving forward. And here we are close to 1 year of October 25th. The things that we've noticed that have improved in the course of the past year would be that there's more dialogue happening at the state level. There are more people at the state level who are recognizing the needs of the deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind community. Again, remember before this event, people did not acknowledge the deaf and hard of hearing community. There was little bits of acknowledgement here and there, but since October 25th, there has been a huge change in recognition of different challenges and more people at the table at the state level. Fortunately, the Maine Association of the Deaf received a grant, which is called the Supplemental Emergency Response Grant. These funds have helped us to provide trainings, to provide resources for our deaf and hard of hearing community and the interpreter community after the events of October 25th. So we are seeing slight improvements, but again, the challenge lies in the same old. Shortage of interpreters, people not respecting deaf and hard of hearing individuals' time, even reporters, news outlets saying, hey, I want to get an interview with you. Can you bring your own interpreter with you? Well, here we are almost a year later, and we're still seeing that they're not receiving the message. There's a lot of work still left to be done. What I'm seeing from the deaf community itself is that they've gotten stronger. They've become far closer because we know that nationwide, they're looking at us. They're looking at the work that we're doing. They're watching the progress that we're making in order to change policy, to change the things that have happened so that other states with deaf and hard of hearing communities do not have to experience what we experienced here. And so we are hopeful that the work that we're doing within the community becomes a model for other states to adhere to recognize, and know that they can improve their systems in their state so that they can provide equal access to communication. When we're thinking about hospital settings, this is one of the biggest barriers of all time that we're still facing to this day. Hospitals are heavily reliant on video remote interpreting. For that reason, is because it's cheaper and it's available. However, you have to remember that those interpreters who are on the video screen are not local interpreters. The majority of them are not from Maine, so therefore they're not familiar with Maine culture, the history of the Maine deaf community. Some of the signs that they use are not, they're either incorrect terms or incorrect signs, incorrect diagnoses, different treatments. And so that's where a lot of calls that we're receiving at Disability Rights of Maine are complaints made by deaf and hard of hearing individuals who are frustrated with their appointments at doctor's offices. They're upset that they're not receiving equal access to communication. And that is an ongoing battle. How we can resolve this issue would be if we had a magic wand to increase our pool of interpreters in the state of Maine, which would mean that we could have in-person interpreters for every medical appointment, because it would be direct access to communication right in person. Now, with the work that I do, I'm working alongside with the AG's office, and we are working closely with the State of Maine Criminal Justice Academy. We are working together to improve their training, to expand their training of cultural knowledge of deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind and deaf with additional disabilities. And so we're trying to expand their curriculum so that first responders have appropriate training for these sorts of situations. Their survivors have come to me to explain their stories that they've experienced with first responders, and it was scary. It is scary. They would go to hearing individuals to ask for their stories about the deaf person rather than going directly to the source, because they didn't have access to communication, and access to communication was not provided. And this is happening, and it needs to change. So the work that I do with the Maine State Police will be transforming the training that they're receiving, which would hopefully disseminate to other local municipalities and to other county sheriff departments to really have a thorough understanding of the culture and an understanding of the language, and knowing how to properly approach deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, deaf with additional disability individuals. And so these are the changes that we're hoping to see happen. And my work requires me to do a lot of traveling to all 16 counties to provide trainings of deaf cultural awareness trainings. And so these is progress that we're seeing with our first responders. But these things can't happen in medical facilities until we see changes happen first. And that's where the lack of information is missing. And that's where a lot of work needs to happen moving forward. But from now, what I have seen over the course of the last year, we're seeing transition happening. It's slow. It doesn't happen overnight, but it is happening. The community is starting to notice change. They're starting to realize how it is that all of you can help us break down those barriers. And the way to take those barriers down is just to be there to support us. You don't have to be experts, but just work with us to help take those barriers down. So the survivors and the victims don't have to experience what they experienced that night all over again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I feel like I learned some stuff right in that. Even though we've been covering this, there's still more to learn always. Well, I think we've reached the moment where we're going to take some audience questions. I think that, do we have any cue cards from those? I can't see, lights are in my eyes. Okay. If you have a card, I think you can hand it up, and our audience folks are going to take it. And Sophie and Sadie are going around handing them in. Thank you. Okay. Okay, here we go. How did you think about reporting a podcast versus reporting as you do for broadcast? For example, did we make these stories for more of a national audience or a local one, or is a national audience there for this story? These are great questions, and you got multiple questions in there. Thank you for that. I don't know, I'll throw it to our panel. What do you think? Have you? How did you think about this for a podcast versus for broadcast?
Well, for context, I think most of the stories that we do are at most 6-8 minutes long, and some of these episodes are 3-4 times that length. I think the longest story I ever did before I did this podcast episode was 10 minutes, and that was a retrospective of former Governor Paul LePage, and that felt like a journey. That was a long, that was a long project. This is, again, 3-4 times that length. So in that context, that's just the writing is completely different. The way, and this is part of the struggle, I think, honestly, for me personally, is the writing is completely different. The way you present things in broadcast is a lot different than you do for this podcast audience, because it's more narrative driven versus, kind of giving you the basics of a news story. It's freeing in a lot of ways. We get to use profanity, which I love. And I think the other piece that's, I think was the other part of the question was about the national audience. Well, we are partnering with Frontline, so the idea is to make this series appealing to a national audience, and that means sometimes telling the local folks things that they already know, and not taking those things for granted, because a lot of folks are coming to this completely green. So that's different too, although, a lot of us file for NPR, Patty's filed for NPR, so we have some experience with that. This is different, just again, with the length, the narrative style that is given or is used to tell these stories, and how to keep it going, with good tape. In my case, there's a lot of archival tape, fresh interviews that haven't been heard before, and that's really exciting to be able to weave those things all into one giant story, which hopefully people will stay and listen to.
I wonder, Steve Collins and John Terhune, you're both writing extensively for local papers, but that stuff can get picked up, right, by bigger national outlets, or how do you think about local versus national in your reporting?
I leave those questions to my editor, Julia, for the most part, and trust that she's going to answer them for us.
The dodge. I like it.
Yeah, I never leave anything to editors. But I also don't, I'm writing for the audience of the Sun Journal, and, if other people read it, that's great.
That's great. A question here about a segment of the population argues that the problem of gun violence should be solved by addressing mental illness. Given your experience trying to gather information about mental illness in this instance, how realistic do you feel a proposed solution is?
So I'm glad that the question is framed this way in terms of looking at it as like gun control versus mental illness, because that's what I thought of it coming into it. Like, you always hear the argument against the pro-gun control is, well, the real problem is mental illness. But it feels to me like the conversation just kind of stops there most of the time. Like, I don't even know what we're talking about when we say, like, okay, well, then how do you fix mental illness? I just published a story looking at this law called the Progressive Treatment Program. It is a form of involuntary treatment. The idea is that somebody who maybe doesn't need to be involuntarily hospitalized, like in an old school psychiatric institution. We can find some way to at least make sure that they're following their treatment plan at home or keeping an eye on them. It's kind of controversial. There's a whole lot of reasons why this doesn't get used, some of which are valid and some of which are just because the law hasn't been kind of appropriately discussed, and we haven't figured out how to use it well. But even like that law is really a Band-Aid to the much deeper problem, which is that our mental health system is kind of broken way upstream of this. There's not nearly enough funding. There's not enough providers. And what that means is there's a huge group of people who don't ever encounter the mental health system. They never go see a doctor until they're already at a point of crisis. So I don't think that there's any sort of quick and easy solution when we're talking about mental health. Like, we're talking about really like pouring resources into this system, rebuilding it from the ground up. The experts I talk to say that we have a pretty good idea what a better system would look like. We just haven't gone nearly far enough in terms of building that out. And that's a story that goes back decades and decades at this point. So it's a question for your legislators, I think. I think we know how to get there. Whether it is feasible is a different question.
Steve Collins, this might be a question for you. The Resiliency Center here in Lewiston, what do we know about what it's doing? How operational is it, and what's going on there?
Well, I know there are many people who are using it, relying on it, that it's helping people just learn to cope. It is involved in all kinds of different things. I mean, from, I don't know, they're very heavily involved in trying to create a memorial to this someday. It's sort of at the center of a big group of people who are trying to help. And the Resiliency Center has been really key for a lot of people, and there's a lot of talk about how we're going to keep it going for a long time to come. Hope we can.
I think this is our final question for tonight. What reporter panel is your takeaway from this year of coverage? And I'll throw it out as a jump ball again, which is my go-to when I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
I mean, honestly, I think it's really hard to answer that question. Like one takeaway, maybe I had a half dozen takeaways, and then I read John's story about progressive treatment program on Sunday, and I said, okay, well, that's really fascinating. I don't know. That's a tough question. I think, from my perspective, I think for me personally, and the role that I do, I think what happened in October 25th and how that affected me and my beat and made me rethink a lot of the debates that we hear in Augusta, which tend to be pretty high level, highly rhetorical, partisan, like charged partisanship, that sort of thing, and abstract. What happened made those policy discussions more real, at least for me. And that's my personal takeaway, that there are lives at stake when people are talking about reforms in Augusta. We learned that almost a year ago. And it's a good reminder that covering politics and government is not just about covering these abstract, high-level, and often not terribly useful debates on certain policies until you really get down and find out how those affect people and how they might make people's lives better or save some.
Anyone else on a takeaway?
Sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
I think one of my takeaways is just how many people, mass shooting affects. And I think it's something you read about it in other places and you kind of know, but then when it happens here, you just have a much better appreciation for how many lives it affects. And then the other thing I'll just say is a major takeaway for me. It's what I said before, but I just think it's, we try to learn from these things, and interesting how this shooting highlighted some issues that weren't necessarily related to the shooting, but in terms of communication with the deaf and hard of hearing community, how it just brought to light these problems that are all around us that maybe we didn't really see before, and that's just stuck with me.
John?
I've been struck by what seems to be a really widespread impulse to find the one thing that went wrong or the one person who made a mistake, blame that thing, and then say like, okay, we got it. We need a cop to act differently next time. And I think maybe that stems from just the exhaustion that we collectively feel around this issue. But I think it's clear to all of us here that however you want to power rank your order of blame in this, there were a whole lot of things that contributed to it. There were a whole lot of things that went wrong. And whether you think number one on the list is Deputy Aaron Schofield or Maine's gun laws or the mental health system or whatever, this wouldn't have happened if the rest of the system was working properly. And I think that we need to really fight against that urge to think that it's simple, because that's how you don't address the rest of the problems and leave us vulnerable moving forward.
And Steve Collins?
Well, I think all three of these, they're great answers. I think part of it is, I think one of the things that I take away from this is how we, as reporters looking into all of this, this is such a sad, horrible thing. And our job is to kind of put that to the side and tell the story and what we can do about it. And that is a hard task, and I'm so glad that there are people doing it.
Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge Maine Public's president and CEO, Rick Schneider, who's with us tonight. Also, Judy Meyer, executive editor at the Lewiston Sun-Journal. Jody Jowert, Lewiston Sun-Journal publisher. And thank all the newsrooms represented here. That's Maine Public's newsroom. That includes Susan Sharon, Keith Jordahl, and Andrew Catalina in particular. The Portland Press Herald, Julia Aronston, Lewiston Sun-Journal reporting on this. Your work has been tremendous over the past year, and like so many, you've continued to live the story and keep the momentum going on this reporting. Also want to acknowledge our friends and colleagues from Frontline. That's Aaron Texera and Erica Howard, who are here in the audience somewhere, and who they have also pushed their own boundaries to make this project possible. So I just want to say thank you to Frontline for that. Thanks to all our presenters and our panelists tonight. Thank you to our American Sign Language interpreters, and thank you to you, our audience, both online and in person. I'm Mark Simpson, and thank you so much. Clear.